Hello everyone, thanks for coming to the first session of the workshop Philosophers Diagram by Thomas Mical. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly.
Close enough.
Okay.
Mi-
What's the...
Michael, but it's fine.
Okay. No, it's not close enough. It's Michael from now
Yeah.
on. Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm Begum and I will be the moderator for this workshop. So, Philosopher's Diagram investigates the conceptual and affective power of diagrams across the history of continental philosophy. We explore how philosophical diagrams operate as devices, both exposing and producing structures of thought. Drawing from ancient metaphysics, media theory, and speculative techniques, we engage diagrammatics not merely as interpretation but as method. Each session is organized around a specific thematic or philosophical problem, time, perception, subjectivity, interface, the event, and activated through a curated archive of historical and contemporary diagrams. It is much a visual as a conceptual inquiry. The workshop delaminates the diagrammatic unconscious of philosophy, revealing how thought itself can be shaped and unfolded through spatial-logical forms. The workshop culminates in a hands-on practicum where participants develop original diagrams in real time. These may range from philosophical systems to affective cartographies, cinematic temporalities, or synthetic cosmograms. The goal is to equip participants with tools to construct their own situated speculative diagrammatics, intuitive yet precise, aesthetic yet structural, metaphysical yet grounded. So, let me briefly introduce Thomas Mical. He is a professor of architectural theory and has nomadically taught the history of modern thought in architecture, medieval surrealism, science fiction film theory, all sorts of diagrammatology, and curious transdisciplinary doctoral design research methods for many decades in the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, EU, China, and India. He is currently writing a retrospective theory fiction monograph titled Terraforming the Unconscious. Since the pandemic, he has experimented with several initiatives such as paraphysician on call at Living Midnight Narrative Outfit, India, as researcher with Extraordinary Experimental Lab EEL UK, as adjunct professor National Institute of Advanced Studies Bangalore Center for Consciousness Studies, India, teaching with the New Center for Research and Practice, US, and continuing as book series editor for Architectural Intelligences with Brill, Netherlands. Okay, without further ado, I pass the floor to you, Thomas.
All right. Thank you, Begum, and welcome everyone. Very happy to see all of you here. And I just have to say that this course is a obsessive and passion-driven course. It is not a text-based course. So I'm hoping that you'll be good sports about that because a lot of the material that we will cover will be visual, anecdotal, and draw from a great variety of disciplines because I know we've got the four different I guess, focus of the New Center students. So what I'm going to do is jump right into my PowerPoint. As a design professor, we always get our strength from our images. Everyone can see that? We're good? All right. Okay. So this is where you're supposed to be. If you've signed up for another course, this is where we're at. And I'm teaching this course in some ways as a recalibration. I've taught a couple of courses about every 2 years. I teach something new that I've discovered and learned at the New Center. So I'm going through a phase right now of working through philosophy by means of diagram, not philosophy for itself, but actually trying to bring philosophical issues and topics into the wider language of diagrams. So just a little housekeeping. My very first semester as a undergraduate student, I was taught by a professor who studied with Albers at Black Mountain College. She was a textile professor. She taught me how to do diagrams and published my work when I was an 18-year-old. When I did my master's thesis at Harvard, as you can see here, it was based on analyzing the science fiction film Blade Runner, and then using that to develop a series of architectural and cinematic scripts organized around the idea of diagrams and built diagrams and mobile sections. So each morning for my master's thesis, I would get up, read some philosophy or film theory, do a diagram of it, and then turn it into a model. So at the end of the semester, I had 60 of each of those. And they said, if you don't learn how to finish a project, you're going to wind up being a professor. So 34 years later, being a professor for 34 years, I'm pretty happy with the choice that I made. But diagrams have always been a big part of my way of understanding and making sense of the world, and particularly for translating and transcoding from one discipline or practice to another. And coming from the design background, translating ideas that are not normally part of the register of what was design, bringing them in and out through diagrams was actually a very important form of traffic. I did most of my doctoral dissertation, which was looking at Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence and its relationship to fragmentary writing of Maurice Blanchot, and also the metaphysical urbanism of the proto-surrealist painter Giorgio de Chirico. I did most of my dissertation here in this bombed out apartment building in Berlin, East Berlin, called Tacheles, which was an artist squat, where I was also at Humboldt University as a visiting student as well, too. And in that case, it gave rise to this I guess, this nomadism. It was from that point onwards that, like Nietzsche, I found that the ideas could travel and I could port them from place to place, and then they would get, infused by the local context and then transform. When I finished my PhD many, many years ago, I was told by my supervisor, your work on Nietzsche and de Chirico is fascinating. You could either go into a career researching fascism or surrealism, pick one, don't do both. And so I went the surrealist route. So my first book was actually still in print, strangely, on surrealist thought and practice of modern architecture. And I think that's not how a lot of people used to know me early in my career. And that, for those of you that are aspiring to be scholars and publish, what you publish first and early often becomes your reputation. So think about that. And currently, I'm semi-retired, living in the Indian Himalayas. I'm adjunct professor at places all over the world. I tend to move from city to city. I don't fly on airplanes very much anymore, though. I stay in India and take the trains. And I'm running something called the Esoteric Library, which is my book collection plus other book collections that we're absorbing into this research center. That's not the actual location. My partner asked me to remind you, this is an AI generated image that I've pitched kind of as a joke. Our library looks nothing like that. But we're located in the Indian Himalayas, and we do a lot of work with people hothousing PhD proposals around the world. So let's jump into the topic if you're okay. Instead of coming out and saying what diagrams are, I want to talk about something slightly different than that, because I assume most people are in the course because they either have experience with diagrams or they've used diagrams or they have some understanding of the importance of diagrams to convey non-standard knowledge. It's common in a lot of schools now for students, young children in particular, to be taught literacy and numeracy. But visual acuity or even, musical acuity has disappeared from a lot of places. And the danger of that is actually limits your not just your bandwidth, but your ability to understand and represent things. So, for example, data viz, one of the biggest fields in graphic design and design schools, representing big data, but also in health sciences. There's a lot of things in the body that cannot be written about or simply measured, but have to be drawn or represented. And as a consequence, I think there's a great increasing need as the complexity of the world becomes more manifest or appears to become more chaotic for us to understand and have systems to make sense of it. And this is why today we'll talk a little bit about Plato and the difference between the intelligible and the sensible and those things that kind of slip between them. But I thought I would start off by doing something a little bit risky and taking a working definition of something that I'm calling diagrammatics, which is a type of, I guess, method, an iterative method that I have learned and taught from everything from small children to PhD students around the world quite often for about 30 years in different formats. So this is, a summary of more, I guess, practical teaching experience. But diagrammatics, I'm calling it, as a body of practices. It's not simply a book of outcomes or a collage of images. It's a complex process of creating visible schemas of invisible concepts, forces, and fields. So this is one of the most important devices that diagrammatics allows you to do. So if you're working with abstractions, for example, like love or justice, it's often very difficult to point to examples or to bring it into, the world of the pragmatists or the naive positivists. But if you can understand how not just categories work and processes work, but you can find simple ways to represent them. And more often than not, it's, the letter A and the letter B and a red arrow between them. That's the first primitive start of, a career in doing diagrams. And so having an idea of how to reduce or to simplify things, clarify them, but also to work with visual language, geography, geology, geometry, all of those things that have forms of I guess, figures of thought and forms of measure implied within them. That's kind of where we go. And particularly this ability, I think I've argued in classes sometimes that this is a superpower. To make the invisible visible is not simply in the realm of art or science, but in some ways I would say it's a human cognitive superpower that we have, that we can take things that are not visible, whether they're forces, whether they're, emotions or affect, whether they're slow evolutionary processes that are invisible to us, and making them visible. And one of the techniques that I've increasingly been drawn to, again, moving away from the sciences but not abandoning them, is looking at, besides inductive and deductive reasoning, which is a basis for a lot of analytical philosophy and basic logic too, right? But looking at those kind of fuzzy logic areas that are drawn on more heavily by people in my home disciplines, which would be, art, architecture, design, cinema, performance as well, where things called transductive, abductive, and analogical logic often replaces the inductive or deductive. And I'll have a slide later to explain this too. One of my mentors told me, he said, we don't have the burden of proof of demonstrating something is true in our professions. And this was both teaching profession, design profession. He said, but we do have the obligation to demonstrate. And this is also coming from the medical fields too. The earliest work in medical science was often based on demonstration first and then theorizing later. The skill component of diagrammatics, and this is a definition that I'm using and developing, involves activating a mental, haptic, rapid apparatus of capture. So it's like think fast, draw fast. It's like catching butterflies or catching fish. As you're reading something, people will annotate. I learned how to diagram. This is like a stenographic shorthand. And then I learned how to do it fast through practice. And it became very easy for me to take complex things and reduce them into very clear and simple diagrams that could also be elaborated, but also traded, and they start to have an exchange value, right? And this apparatus of capture, if you think about diagramming as that, it's not creating a work of art, and it's not simply basically like a graphing exercise in mathematics. It's an apparatus of capture in a graphic code. And this is where it gets fun, because everyone's diagrammatic technique, like their cooking technique or their dance technique, or dare I say their swearing techniques, all of them have an individual style. And that's something that you actually should elaborate. And we'll learn how to do that starting with today's workshops too. And this apparatus of capture is for seizing emerging proto-concepts within your streaming consciousness or the streaming reality, or as one of my students said, the reality bites outside of you. The risk of the work is actually quite low. People will not die. You will not go bankrupt or be homeless if you make mistakes. The real risk is not trying. Failure lies in trying in the first instant to even capture this. So, like Ratatouille said, everybody can diagram, even small children. And we're going to build up some skills, and we're going to learn how philosophers have done it. And then we're going to look at, ways that certain things in philosophy can be transcoded into other disciplines. And then we'll understand the underlying schemas and geometries. And then you will have some really good power tools in your toolbox for working through whatever disciplines or whatever projects you're working on. We'll talk more about, how we'll talk about the advantages of that later, but I want to say that the risks are actually quite low. Even if your emerging diagrams in this workshop are low res or incomplete or seem contingent, they'll work. Right? Think of it as just good enough, or good enough for now. As my dissertation supervisor said, that's the best dissertation you can do now. Don't beat yourself up over it. That saved me a lot of grief. So just being in the moment and being where you are. As such, diagrammatics, again, which is a practice, and not simply a outcome generating mechanism, requires a faith and fidelity to this idea of multiplicity. So this is also a core belief that I'm going to try to show you. There is no one right way to represent everything. If you have gone through a school system that teaches you there is a correct answer, I will aggravate you, because I will say, a good question is only as good as, as the possible answers, and a better question is always better than a good answer. So having questions at the core of your work will produce multiple iterations, multiple attempts. Okay? As a multiple iterations, and we use an iterative process in design. So that's like making a bike that's good enough and then modifying it, to then modifying it again, then testing it. The iterative process is often how you will learn things such as language, or even complex cognitive skills, or music. Trial and error is another way to think about it, fuzzy logic, heuristics, but it's iterative. It doesn't mean that there's a destination or a single conclusion or one correct diagram, right? It's actually an emerging series. And these will form, and even in this course is what we'll work towards, a living bestiary of figures of thought. So you can think about all these strange monsters and all these strange hybrids and mutants that you will be developing by trying to experiment with the different concepts and different graphic representations of concepts to create something that shows the figures of thought that are unique and important to you too. So it's highly customized and it's highly independent work, although we'll have some shared prompts, and we'll learn a lot from each other. So the core content really is about the idea of the philosopher's diagram. And in particular, the idea that the most complex and nuanced, sophisticated line of reasoning itself, if it's a line of reasoning, then it can be shown as a line. If it's describing a field condition, then it can be shown as a field. And so there's always within even the language itself that's being used in philosophical analysis or exposition or demonstration, there was always within that some sort of implied spatial or temporal structure. And that's usually the beginning of our scaffolding for doing diagrams. I'm pitching this example from someone who's summarized the ideas of Simondon, who's becoming quite influential these days, was very influential in his time, particularly on Deleuze and the Deleuzians. But this idea of how individuation occurs from a particular phase state. And that including his theories of technology, where the magical precedes the technological, but contains within it, traces of that process as well. And as we can see here, the idea of the metastable, which is, something that appears, stable enough for now, but we'll see how it goes. So I guess that's one way to think about it, which is also another way of talking about being, which in philosophy, many of you will know, being describes the sum total of all that exists and can exist, or the perpetual, a multiplicity of all the things that we can know, both visible and invisible. We'll get back to that too. Now, one thing to perhaps keep in mind, and I'll try to be respectful of this, again, noting my own intellectual genealogy, is the difference between a philosopher's diagram and an artist's diagram. When I was learning stage design, I got reprimanded by the teacher at Yale who said, "You're a designer. Lines do not represent works of art or beauty. Lines are for demarcating the location of boundaries and technology." And I said, that's actually very close to what happens in architecture too. You have lines that delimit or lines that, express. As an oversimplification. And this diagram, which came, I believe, from the Fluxus movement, it's looking at different types of, I guess, the new performances, particularly technologically mediated or interpenetrating technology in what was called at that time intermedia, of the different types of, I guess, emergent forms and their possible relationships. So you can see here, this is perhaps a meta model of a portfolio of all possible creative works that could be accomplished using different technologies and techniques. So this is a diagram that is quasi-scientific, but it's certainly trying to be in some ways at least rational, if not empirical, about different artistic processes and how they intersect and interlock. So it's kind of crossing that line between being about the creation of or expression through art and the representation of the boundaries of these different disciplinary or subdisciplinary practices. This is a Fontana mix by John Cage. And so this is a musical score and part of his experimental work in musical notations, influenced by different forms of minimalist graphic arts. I was fortunate enough to see him give a talk when I was a master's student. But he was looking very much at the time about silence and chants as generators, something that will come back again towards the end of today's talk too. And just on that topic, I'll probably go for the first half of the course discussing the philosophical principles. Then we'll take a 15-minute break. Then we'll come back and then we'll do a series of exploratory drawing exercises. And this is kind of the pattern that we'll keep through the course. The first half, I tried to, have you drink from the fire hose of all of these different examples. And then the second half, I want you to try to make sense of things and particularly work through a project or some topic you're working on in an individual way and get customized feedback from it too. So the artist can also incorporate diagrams in terms of the mode of representation. And most of you will probably know about Deleuze's book about the diagrammatic work in Francis Bacon. For me, one of the more diagrammatic artists was actually, if you look here, some of you might remember the twittering machine here. But in the works of modern art, and most of the Bauhaus artists that are here, this is Paul Klee, but a lot of the artists he was associated with in and around the Bauhaus were working through abstractions as a way to deal with industrialization so that the forms that could be manufactured maintained a clarity, simplicity, and abstraction. They kind of accidentally found a new type of Platonism in that process. But what Paul Klee often does in his work is he works at the boundaries of both the mythopoetic as well as the empirical and observable. And you can see here on the left the twittering machine, which became the basis for Twitter. And on the right, he's got some great subjectivity diagrams too. And the famous Angelus Novus that Benjamin had is also drawn in that technique, often with lithographs or other sorts of subtractive processes. But on the right, his painting of the landscape was actually taken from a balloon trick too. And it creates a very different, I guess, understanding of industrialization and big agro at a time when Europe was just going through this industrial transformation too. There wasn't quite the language yet for visual representations of, say, aerial topographies or this idea of completely mechanical landscapes. But Paul Klee gave it a good shot in his diagrammatic paintings as well too. My colleague Simon O'Sullivan, I'm showing some examples from his great bodies of work about subjectivity diagrams and performative diagrams. He's written some of the best books about diagrams, from translating philosophy into artistic practice, and this is from one of his books. And you might recognize in these little hybrids, I'm bringing this up as a kind of a mixed genre diagram. The Lacanian diagrams, you may know from theories of subjectivity and psychoanalysis, have been superimposed with literal elements from Haitian voodoo practices and ritual practices in particular, kind of, playing with the idea that psychoanalysis and spirit possession might have something to, communicate to each other through the diagram. And I think that's really clever and curious too, because this is also a reminder next week when we look at some of Alfred Gell's work in anthropology too, the ability to translate or transcode or even use bricolage techniques across different graphic systems is actually core to doing diagrams. You don't have to have one particular system. It's not like graphing mathematics. In many ways, it's much more like cooking, and bringing together things that might not normally belong together is a way to establish structures, schemas, and relationships. And particular, and we'll do this in one of the exercises, particularly things that are exceptions or outliers are very easy to recognize and also very easy to diagram, because often there's a system or a pattern that is the underlying schema. And then from that, you can start to show where, things go off the rails, or, the continental and the swerve starts from what seems to be a very simple linear trajectory. Sorcerer's diagrams are not, they're not philosophers' diagrams. I actually placed them on a spectrum now. And you can see here, these are the sigils that are used to explain the essences of different demonic entities, drawn something like choreographies. And you can find a great body of work. And a lot of people work in sigils as well, but also sorcerer's diagrams often go back to some of the earliest esoteric and theurgic texts that were done in parallel with philosophy, but in many ways offer not an anti-philosophy in the Laurel sense, but a counter-philosophy in the Foucault sense, working with the mysterious forces and the esoteric beliefs as alternative truth systems to philosophical abstraction or logical deduction and positivist truths. And sorcerer's diagrams are often tied to shamanic practices, but they've also come back, particularly in a lot of media theory too. There is like this undercurrent of occult knowledge in some media work, and there's always new books coming out about haunted media and things of that nature, which I always find kind of curious and at one level fascinating, because in many ways it works. It's almost like the photographic negative of what philosophers are often trying to accomplish, which is often, Descartes and his idea of the geometric composite, nothing that's not clear and distinct. Whereas you're like, well, actually, there's a lot of things that are neither clear nor distinct, but I'm going to draw them anyway. So this is that realm. I won't read this to you, but it's just a quick snapshot there. There was a Deleuze conference here in India in January. I got to see some old friends there, and I did a paper for all my philosopher friends about sorcerer diagrams, and looking particularly at the idea of how the sorcerer diagram can be triangulated and create forms of signification, but also to produce effects. So in some ways, a sorcerer's diagram it follows a bit of the model of the artistic production, in that is intended to produce effects in the universe and not simply be a circuit diagram or a schematic of the real structure of reality per se. And we'll play with that distinction a little bit farther, but I'm showing both artistic diagrams and sorcerer diagrams. One you've heard of, one you probably haven't heard of, are clearly distinct from what philosophers or how philosophers have often used diagrams. And we're not going to use diagrams to learn philosophy in this course. I think the strength of the course will actually be trying to, jump between them. So that's why we're going to talk about right now Plato a bit, and particularly his construct of being and how, where does the universe come from is basically where I'm heading with this. But we're not going to talk about it philosophically. There's a lot of material on this. Plato's been written about more than anyone. But as you can see, it's being for diagrammatics. So the other question is, what in all of that discourse or what in all of that complexity do you find to be clear and distinct and worthy of representing, drawing, or annotating? So Plato himself has a lot to say, most of it negative about representation per se. You'll know that the idea of the craftsman, that the idea of someone who makes a chair is better than someone who, this is from the Republic, is better than someone who does a painting of a chair, and both of them are spying towards a archetypal version of chairness that in its ideal version would be constructed of the five geometric solids that form the Platonic solids. On the upper left, you can see an example of the superimposition of one Platonic solid to another, which is a higher order, recombinant intelligence. That for Plato means moving away from, and this is the dualist world or the divided plane, he calls it. This is, the visible world and the intelligible. And this is often where diagrams are expected to bridge that dualism, in that they have to make the intelligible visible, particularly in the philosophical enterprise. But also, as I was arguing before, images and visible things are often still tied to what Plato would see as the lesser or the more corrupted world, and that's more of a Neoplatist interpretation of imagining and believing and common sense. Even the politics of the markets and the polis go down to that lower level of doxa, which is often unformed or unstructured knowledge and much more impressionistic and insight-based. In the intelligible world, as you can see, mathematical objects, and Plato is very, very clear about this. And it's been argued, I think, somewhat convincingly, that he adopts some of the mystical practices, but transforms them in his work, that he takes the flux of becoming, probably most widely associated with Heraclitus, and then masks it with a set of abstraction or permanence or idealism that is associated with Parmenides. But he doesn't really fully commit to either. He plays with them a lot. So Plato will often set up these so-called dialectic systems, which he's the first to invent it. Even his dialogues came from this. And the truth is always somewhere in between the two. They would stake out two different positions. Although, as one of my instructors, Slavoj Žižek, told me, he says the later Plato dialogues, it's usually Plato monologuing the other person saying, yeah, you're right, I get it, that's good. Right? But in the original ones too, the dialectic was this sense of like convergence through approximation and reconciliation between these two halves, the visible and intelligible. Another word for the visible is the sensible, or things that come to us through our senses, the more animalistic component, whereas the intelligible has to be constructed through reflection. It is often not very self-evident or given, and this is where it's often interpreted as being otherworldly or supernatural or invisible or cognitive or given by the gods or something else, that it's concealed. Whereas for Plato, he saw it as much more of a spectrum, I think, and the idea that this movement from the highest object of knowledge, which is the good, is only recognizable when you can see its traces appear in the world. But it comes through this inductive process, which is theorizing or moving up in levels of abstraction. You're probably familiar with the first descriptions of the cinema, which is Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic. If you're a reader of those, this is actually a Renaissance representation, which I think is fascinating because it looks like a Renaissance crowd attending the festival. And there are two ultimate sources in a lot of the Plato interpretations of the highest good. One was in the material practical world. The sun itself was the dominant form of expressing particularly what was, truth and what was, absolute, which Bataille subverts very much through his accursed share, which was a fascinating read. But Plato also, in celebrating the sun, recognizes it as part of the material world, and he argues in the allegory of the cave that the people who are watching so-called reality on the wall of the cave that's being projected by some puppet masters or performers with a lantern behind them, and they believe they control the true reality. And then obviously one person manages to escape the cave entirely and realizes both of those are incorrect. that they each have a level of reality that meets the reality test of the people in that set or in that group or in that situation, but stepping outside of that into another higher position, and it's always elevated conceptually and graphically. Stepping into a higher position allows you to see, those I guess, limitations. It's like when Heraclitus says, humans are to gods as children are to their parents. And the real, I think the ethical imperative for Plato's cave, again, as a proto-cinematic thing, is that it's not simply a representation of the conscious as mise-en-scene, which would be Lyotard's argument, but also the ethical challenge of if you went out and realized that everyone was following an illusion, would you go back in? That's the red pill, blue pill argument again, too, that comes from this higher level of knowledge. For Plato, there was an obligation to come back and to cut through what he saw as the enemies, obviously, the sophist discourse, the ability to lie with beauty and impunity, which is what Plato was most strongly against consistently in his writing. He points out, and I think this is quite interesting, in Timaeus, which is basically a construction manual of the universe, if I can call it that, that the cosmos themselves come from a process or from a sequence. And for someone who argued that craftsmen are in the middle of truth, they're better than painters and sophists, but not as good as mathematicians or philosophers. He says the three primary pillars in the universe are the idea of the model, and this became very, very influential when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance, as his writings were translated either from the original Greek, or in another case, had been translated from Greek to Arabic and then back into more of the contemporary languages like Italian during the Renaissance. So the idea of the model as something like a schema or as a prototype become very dominant. And then the demiurge, which is also the Gnostic term for the false god that was hiding people from accessing the true God, and the one that actually made the world is the maker, right? Supreme craftsman. So there's craft still showing up, but it also has the idea of that demiurge and craftsman being in the middle. It's an intermediary role, that this making of the universe or this construction of the cosmos, if there is any sort of hand in it or agency, is actually as a mediator, not as an origin. And then the receptacle, which is the material, right? Shapeless, chaotic, void, containing the basic building blocks of physical matter. Another word for that is the chora. And we'll talk about that at length, and particularly how that got transformed in post-structuralist philosophy as a very sophisticated way of coming to understand how things in the world come about in their incompleteness and in their multiplicity. Right? So it moves away from this idealist model very much. And then coming after that, the world soul, which has to do with things that are changing and unchanging. This is the fundamental dialectical tension we find in a lot of Plato's early work. It gets brought up again in the mystical philosopher Hegel, who tried to take some of the Meister Eckhart's mystical practices and rationalize them by his own admission, and to find a rational process of moving through different states of consciousness or levels of reality. And the first two parts that he has in his this is Hegel in his Logic of Science, has to do specifically with the idea that there's being and nothingness, and in their dynamic interaction, becoming, where things start to appear. And for Plato, being is a thing that bridges the same and the difference. Or another way to think about it is being is the sum total of all possible combinations. And in the Timaeus, there's this fascinating description. There's lots of drawings that people have been models of this too. It cuts the mixture into the giant X, or the chiasm, the crossing, as it's called in phenomenology, forming the celestial spheres that wrap around each other. So this is the idea of a layered universe, and this is the idea of both nested systems, but also the idea that emanations would go both ways, from center out and from outside in. So there was a belief that the planets, which were interpreted in a variety of ways, were seen as both signaling as well as receiving signals too. If we look at the fundamental condition of the cosmos before the demiurge worked on them, it was often thought that it was chaos. The Babylonians and others would describe chaos through the aquatic nature of the earth before the earth rose and the creatures rose out of the sea. So one of the oldest archetypal models we have of chaos is actually the ocean. More so than the stars, which had much more regularity to it. And in this essay from Stan Allen called Object to Field, he makes an argument that in the late 20th century, particularly with the rise of the digital age and the so-called ascendancy of the virtual, that a fundamental and profound shift happens in the understanding and perception of field conditions, that is, relationships between different objects or entities within a discipline, within a discourse, within a territory. And on the left, you can see something coming from Mondrian, which is, the object in the field, or Gestalt theory is one way to think about that. The interpenetration or the interrelationship between solid and void, between inside and outside, that they create this sort of a not static, but equilibrium type condition of constructions and appearances and objects in the world that have equilibrium to them. Even in ecosystems, there's the idea of punctuated equilibrium, where something is, like the world stays fine until a comet hits it, and then all the dinosaurs disappear because the sun disappears for 6 years. On the right, he's got a diagram from some of the works, not from Mandelbrot, but this is from Complexity Science, and particularly this is a diagram of the strange attractors, which would be mathematically modeled in complex systems. And so they're not really physical things you can locate, but they become mathematical representations of these systems that become unstable through minimal difference or minimal changes. As a consequence, to oversimplify chaos, it is that ability to produce the novel, the new, the unexpected, the accidental, the black swan event coming out of something that appears to be a stable condition. So Stan Allen, who's an architect, makes this fundamental argument, looking at, for example, the development of new types of music in the 20th century, and says that this is increasingly how field conditions are operated, that we have the appearance of stability, we have the appearance of a dynamic system, but there's always that potential within it for it to not just become unstable, but for strange things or monsters or, the unexpected to emerge from it too. And this is something that will keep coming back today as one of the fundamental, interesting challenges and problematics, particularly for philosophy that follows from the Platonic tradition. Daniel Libeskind, the architect early in his career, did this diagram as a series of diagrams, chamber works, trying to illustrate the idea of a world of pure flux or pure flow, coming from an understanding of Heraclitus. But he used a very, very precise late modern representational technique of drafted ink on mylar, and a lot of, you can see tectonic elements and devices there coming from almost the end phase of conceptual art or minimalism in the United States, and then this turn towards something that later became much more like the collage artists. And all this drafting exercise is something in the architecture field was quite influential too, because it showed how even with the highest degree of mathematical precision and clarity and clear and distinct objects and entities, you can still create systems that have the dynamic turbulence of, say, some of Da Vinci's drawings of the flow of water or the movement of blood through the body. And so even in the most static of elements, these appearances or these representations of the idea of flux or chaos are become caught in this apparatus of capture. But for Plato and many of the Neoplatonists, it was there at the beginning. Cosmogenesis, not in the sense of Blatsky and the Theosophists, but perhaps a little bit influenced by that. Cosmogenesis is the idea that there is some sort of mechanism or mechanisms in play that allow for the cosmos to emerge from chaos. And for us, not in terms of, say, astrophysics or even metaphysics per se, let's look at it in terms of some diagrams and the diagrammatics associated with how the idea of the cosmos or order can come out of the chaotic situations. One of the stronger or, I guess more dominant systems, particularly here in our region in India, the tantric knowledge systems, which came out many, many centuries ago, which later led to Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and a bunch of variants of that too. Tantric practices are often based on the idea of trying to expand consciousness to encompass greater and greater degrees of reality. In this Tibetan version that we can see, the mandala system represents idealized or schematized vision of the world. There's the four towers guarding the inner sanctum from the outside world. And this is both a representation of civilization, but primarily it's a model of consciousness too. And it also shows a strong sense of geometric order. There's differentiation. The four towers always have different attributes. And the idea that the self is integrating multiplicities and these strong geometries and these significant color and other figures. And there's whole iconography that has evolved over the centuries in the same way that different types of Buddhism have evolved particularly in this region of the Himalayas. These types of diagrams are often not seen as diagrams, but as meditative devices, because that's their useful function in a lot of places. It's a device to meditate on the complexity and to achieve oneness. In some ways, Jung talked about this too. He said at some point in one of his books that when the psyche is going through fragmentation, there starts to be a deep interest in mandalas, wheels, and other sorts of diagrammatic forms of integration too. So this is a device that integrates, even though you can see differentiated parts. And again, geometry is one of the reliable tools for keeping thing in its proper place, location, or measure. You see the very same thing with the metaphysical speculator Robert Fludd. Came a little bit after John Dee in Renaissance England. And he was very, very interested in the idea of these harmonious relationships that transcended scales of reality, but also worked across different systems of reality too. So that intellectual systems and biological systems and social systems each had their place. They were apportioned. They had a clear and precise relationship and ratio to the others. And this is coming from perhaps the clockwork universe that Descartes fantasized about. But this one is a metaphysical system that tries to take into account all possible elements and group and cluster them into discrete or distinct layers. You can see how it looks a little bit like, a diagram of an electron. And you can also see, the figure of knowledge herself there, Sophia, the mystical figure receiving enlightenment from an obscured God behind the clouds, who's translating to her wisdom, and then she encompasses and embodies wisdom, and then brings that to man on the earth. And then from that central point, all of the other knowledge systems and all the other scales of reality emanate from and circulate around. And it creates kind of this locked-in system, right? It's very much these ideas of these integrated layers of reality, more often than not, often shown with this idea of a centralized geometry. If you take that idea of the universe as a circle, or as the sum total of our event horizon of our own subjectivity, and maybe the sense that phenomenologists viewed it, the hermeneutic horizon perhaps, and you start to push it along a timeline, then you wind up with a diagram that's something like this, the Big Bang. And this is as far as I know, the current state of knowledge of how the universe came to be and where it's headed. And when I was a little kid back in the 20th century, when there was no internet and Pluto was still a planet, they told us they didn't know if the universe was expanding or contracting, but they knew it was doing one of the two. Now they know that it's expanding at the horrific rate that pretty soon, in cosmological time, not in our personal lifetime, cosmological time, many of the galaxies will be so far from each other that they won't be able to see each other, because light will not be able to travel that distance anymore, as the galaxies disappear. And so, but the thing that fascinates me about this cosmology machine, which is our Big Bang model, is there's this moment where everything occurs. And this is, a philosophical and a cosmological problem. And then almost an instantaneous expansion, right? Quite literally, the Big Bang means some sort of explosion happened. And then there's something called the Dark Ages, where the stars don't form for the longest of times. And that's the chaos. That is neither, solid nor void. That is neither figure nor ground. That is, proto galaxies as possibilities coming out of basically this hypothetical explosion. And there's a lot of attempts to figure out what happens before and what happens at the other end too. But I just wanted to show that this was not, for the philosophers we're talking about today, this was not common knowledge, but in some ways they described a quasi-system that approximates some of this information. And it gets weirder than that. And we'll talk a lot more about this next week when we look at Henri Bergson and some of the other philosophers, and even the poet William Butler Yeats, who see time as a series of interconnected cones. This is actually Minkowski's diagram of the observer in a particular moment of the present being caught between two cones, the future and the past. This is also the idea, if you think about it like in Tenet, that the past and the future both have an equal say in the present. And we'll look at some diagrams next week, particularly Husserl's explorations of time consciousness. It also makes a very similar argument too, that we're caught in between two different time vectors, both pointing towards us in the instance of the present moment. this is a fascinating diagram. It looks like a SpaceX rocket or something, but this is a Penrose's diagram of the forces affecting a black hole and how time comes to stop at a moment, a particular point, which he calls a singularity. So the moment where time stops in the center of a black hole, although there's now some speculation that it doesn't entirely stop too. But this is a fascinating, this is the back end. This is the end of the end, not the origin of the origin that we saw in some of the earlier diagrams. And this is also a diagram that in many ways makes clear what is a very sophisticated and complex process. It probably couldn't be apprehended as easily too. So getting that clarity and not understanding that in diagrammatic representations, it's you just have to show enough, and you have to get the ratios and proportions and the different forces in play. And then you also have to learn, this is a hard part, particularly for students when I teach undergraduates, not to over elaborate it or not to make it too complex. It's like, people in the kitchen discovering they can add spices and putting them all in. Knowing when to stop and enjoying the silence, as one of my Japanese professors told me, is a very important part of doing good diagrams. And understanding here, literally the moment when time stops is a fascinating thing to try to diagram, not just in terms of astrophysics, but also you can think of it in terms of temporality, cognition, representational techniques, performance, or cinema too. So this is one of my favorite diagrams as a former science nerd in high school. This is a very clear diagram that shows basically it's a graph, right? So it's actually a graph. You look at the physical radius at the bottom in numbers of centimeters in logarithmic scale. If you look at the center, it goes from super clusters, galaxy clusters, the Milky Way up near the top, right? So that's its mass is approaching 70. So they've mapped radius and mass of all entities. So near the bottom, you can see the COVID virus, bacteria, fleas, things of this nature. This is a diagram that shows all possible and also the impossible, right? So the areas that are forbidden by gravity because they're too big, like black holes, they could never exist, right? There's a sub-Planckian unknown to the left, and then there's quantum uncertainty when you get so small that, the superposition argument or the Schrodinger's cat, which is, I've actually read Schrodinger recently, and he was using the cat as a negative example. It's not actually a demonstration of his principles. He was using it to warn people not to think in such simplistic terms. It would be outraged. But you can see in this the different boundary conditions, and also the power of this diagram is that the angularity, the diagonals, the strata that are going through it, it very much has a almost the appearance of a design quality, as if there's some intentionality behind this. It's not entirely random, which is fascinating in and of itself. But let's jump from the question of what can exist and not exist in terms of I guess, size and mass to what can we perceive. So this is like a Kantian leap here. This diagram I grabbed from a textbook shows all things that are possible within human experience. So in the center of that diagram, there's a square. Curious that it's a square called human experience, and that's you, and that's me. Right? And there's only things spatially that we can perceive. If things are too big or too small, we don't have the sensory apparatus to perceive them. And the same with temporality too. So by splitting time and space, which I think is a necessary thing to do, as we look at diagrams in particular, perhaps it's also necessary next week when we talk about time consciousness. We'll see how the philosophers on both sides of process philosophy and other fields and scientists split over whether time and space are separate or integrated. But regardless of that, what we're seeing is that without augmentation through media technology or other devices, the gods, astral projection, you name it, whatever we can to, move beyond those threshold or those limit conditions, as Maurice Blanchot would call them, or actually Carl Jaspers described that too. The limit condition of the human experience is actually for him. He said that's at the moment where the existentialist, striving begins. And you're looking at, in some ways, too, I guess, the sum total of all possible representations, because our experience. But we could also move slightly beyond that, too, beyond the hermeneutic horizon or our perceptual apparatus of boundary conditions or the skin of the earth, and to speculate on, what's in that diagonal space outside of our experience, which is a different argument than saying, how do bees think or how do different interspecies communicate through biosemiotics or different techniques like that. So just to shake it up a bit, I would ask each of you to, at least for the sake of the workshop, to have some idea of a cosmology. So if you have a model of reality, which I hope you do, and if you have more than one, which I do, great. And I can tell you how I think Leibniz's cosmology works, and I think I can tell you how Plato's work because I've studied those texts as a student long ago. But I'm wondering about your own cosmology, your own model of reality, right? If you're a hyper-capitalist and the free market determines everything, that's your model of reality, and you can probably find a lot of validation for it in certain ways. If your model of reality is that all of the world is, as I say here, Maya or illusion, and then there's a real world hidden just immediately underneath the sense data of the apparent world, which was Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics. But here it's often seen in many of the metaphysical systems as the basis for understanding reality. You probably have something like a model of reality just to navigate in the world. And I would ask you now, let me stop sharing for a minute. I would like you to think about chaos and how chaos informs, drives, is excluded from, has no place, or is the core value of your model of reality as it stands now. And I would like you, if you don't mind, in the chat box, if you could give me, a very quick A, proof of life, and B, some understanding of where chaos belongs in your understanding of reality, because we're going to be doing some diagrams about that after the break. So I just like to get a quick snapshot, right? As usual, I will go first. Do this for a couple of minutes. But give me a sense of where people are. I have colleagues that cultivate chaos actively as a generator, and I have people who flee from it. Philip K. Dick said, reality is whatever doesn't go away when you ignore it. Yeah, as indeterminate? Yeah, very likely, yes. In a lot of the Platonist and Neoplatonist cosmology, chaos, again, talked or was spoken of in slightly different nuances, but it always had within it the idea of the unformed. It always had the idea of, the indiscernible. It was not complexity per se, but it couldn't be made sense of. It couldn't be represented. It couldn't be understood because it was either too much or too little. So, mm, yeah, a lot of the chaos theory after Gleck's book has been looking at this idea of the thermodynamics and also how that maps into a lot of information theory, which I think was also in some of Simondon's work too. He tried to bridge across those two different disciplines. I think there's another class that's looking at this right now, actually.
I wanted to ask something. Is it possible to send photos or are we writing?
For now, yeah, in the second half, we'll do some diagrams and then we'll post in the chat. That's always a lot. It's like those of you that went to kindergarten that did drawing and show and tell, which is almost everyone, we're going to do a version of that after the break. And people do digital or they'll just take snapshots and post them. But for now, I'm trying to get a sense of I guess, the place, the proportion, the propriety, I guess the pervasiveness of chaos in your thinking about how the world operates. When I used to play Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, there was different ethical systems, and there is chaotic good, chaotic evil, and chaotic neutral. And I was aligned with the chaotic neutral, but then I found out that that included people like Batman and Pirates of the Caribbean and these kind of Charlie Sheen, these rogue characters that don't have a value system at all, and then I kind of abandoned that. Yeah, these are pretty helpful. Hmm. So I'm also getting the sense that this is not the first time you've thought about being in a chaotic world or addressing chaos through your work. It's not an alien term or an alien concept, right? We almost have naturalized it now. And as I said, I've got some colleagues. They tend to move into university admin for some reason that, like to generate chaos so they can come in and save it and get all the raises and promotions. Um, those of your academics know what I'm talking about. Yeah, they usually have MBA after their name too. Sorry if you have an MBA, I'm making fun of them. Probably not polite. But the idea that you would generate chaos, right, was something that particularly in the classical world in antiquity, was not be very well received. That chaos was something that was a default condition that needed to be managed, controlled, or minimized, right? And it's only with, I guess, the 20th century. I was just reading an interesting discussion in one of the readings about Badiou's argument that the 20th century was using romanticist techniques to kill romanticism. And I'm still puzzling over that. There might be something to it too. Yeah, this is great. Apophatic. I've not seen apophatic for a while. That's great. I've been reading a lot of Neoplatonism, so that resonates with me right now. We'll look at a little bit of it in a minute. So it's safe to say that you have some understanding of chaos. You think you could draw it yet? It's coming later. I'm just, foreshadowing what's to come. Because one of the things you'll discover when you do diagrams, the things you don't know are the hardest to draw. And so you can actually use them very much as a diagnostic tool that way too. But we'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, that was pretty good. Begum, is there a way we can capture all of the chat comments? Does that get saved somewhere?
I think it gets saved, but I will uh, save it now, just in case.
Yeah.
Okay.
36 theories of chaos. Yeah, would be good. Okay. Thank you for that. That was very insightful. I was mentioning Neoplatonism. I've got some time here. The Neoplatonist school, which came after Plato and after Aristotle, many of the scholars and the heads of the Athenian Academy that Plato started actually came from what's now present day Africa and the Middle East. So it ceased to be, I guess, Greek in that sense geographically. But one of the other things that happened, to oversimplify the Neoplatonist movement, was also that there is increasingly an attention towards applications of meditative and later iamblichus mystical practices to supplement and eventually to override some of the rational processes and the inductive thinking that Plato celebrated in his work too. Part of that was also, besides the idea that there's two worlds of the given world, or the world of the senses, and then the intelligible world, the world of the mind. You can think of them as like potentially superimposed or hypothetically part of a continuum, but there was a divide, and one was visible and evident, and one wasn't, and so often that divide meant that one of them was absent or occluded, obstructed, or something. And in this diagram from this is a early Renaissance diagram of the chain of being, which talks about moving through different states of reality from the more base material, and that's Bataille's term, not Plato, up through different levels. I guess nowadays we call it, different vibration levels, or different levels of reality, or the medieval, or no, the early modern metaphysicians like Leibniz, Spinoza, Descartes would talk about them as different metaphysical substances, and the mystery was how did they connect. But in the great chain of being was the idea that they were interlocked, that there was the passage from the most base and sensible things to the most intellectually and intuitively constructed, followed the logic of a chain or a ladder. And so it was seen as sequenced. It was seen as, in many ways, preordained and preorganized, and it was seen as the antithesis, the complete opposite of the idea of the chaotic. So there was a place for everything. There was propriety, there was ratio, proportion, balance, there was cause and effect. And all of those things that we often take for granted, and particularly in the sciences, were partially established through these metaphysical systems, and often the representations of them, because they're very hard to grasp, not just in their singularity, but in their interconnectedness too. We can see, for example, Plotinus, who wrote significantly after he retired as the head of the academy, that the highest good has been replaced with the idea of the one. And this was a metaphysical transformation that tied into the theistic movement, and later even he wrote against the Gnostics, who argue that there's two. But the idea of a fundamental unity, that the one, and I'm not talking about Neo in the Matrix, but I'm talking about this idea of the one representing, the highest possible understanding, or, like a pure rational cognition of everything in the universe. It sounds a bit like the idea of enlightenment in some of the tantric knowledge systems too, whereby in the process of understanding in an expanded consciousness sort of sense, the self and the body would dissolve or fade in significance as you achieved this other realm too. But they describe it often through negative terms, the apophatic, or the negative theology, that also came back in some post-structuralist discourse, because it was also inexpressive. It was in many ways not just hidden, but outside of language and outside of the boundaries of being in terms of the entities that exist. And that the overflow, this is an interesting term, I've been using this a lot recently, from the one, this hidden source and this hidden guidance mechanism, or this hidden level of ultimate knowledge, which would probably be much more sophisticated than, say, Vitansky and Desjardins' idea of the noosphere, which is the sum total of all knowledge, or the Akashic record, which records all possible thoughts. But this overflow would lead into the idea of the ideals. So there's something even higher than an ideal that is, dark or hidden to us. And there's even some of that in the Gnostic traces in some of the Sufi philosophies, like Al-Arabi, and the idea of a light that's so bright that it actually comes out as black because we can't sense it properly. And then from that overflow of the intellectual, the soul starts to manifest. And Plotinus and later Iamblichus, the soul vehicle, as you transmigrate, moves from body to body, and part of your soul stays in your body, and part of it is timeless. So there's a bifurcation of the soul that happens. I've got a great book about the divided soul, even in Leibniz's theories too. The all soul, or the higher soul of the, and it's almost like greater degrees of not refinement, but I guess gross fine level detail, the reality of molecules or particles, textures and such, moving from things that are much more obviously aligned with mathematics and music and immaterial ordering systems down to the material, right? And so for Plotinus, chaos appears not as a precursor to the universe, but in the lowest level, in matter itself. And this also echoes perhaps in the first natural scientists, Lucretius and others, who were looking at why are the behaviors of the material world so unpredictable. And if you look at these two different diagrams, you'll notice that On the right, the diagram is simpler. It has less words and details and is probably a better diagram than the diagram on the left, although they're diagramming the same sort of principles. The diagram on the left is a bit more like a notation system. The graphics are in some ways showing the arrows going from the one through the soul down to the individual bodies in the world of matter and sensible world. All of those arrows are the same, whereas the one on the right, some arrows are stronger than others. So there starts to be differentiation just in the graphic language, but also the clarity and simplicity. Whereas on the left, there's almost too much information, but it hasn't been well organized or composed. Looks more like a filing cabinet, whereas the one on the right, you can actually see even with the curvatures, again, that's a deformation of that idea of the cosmologically centered universe or the harmony of the spheres, and now it's becoming this elliptical force like it's being pulled in two different ways. So the diagram on the right is simpler, but it's graphically much more sophisticated and therefore more communicative. So this idea of the one, that all of the universe or all of the things in the universe are united at a higher intellectual level, a level that can be induced but not directly experienced, becomes a fundamental challenge for philosophy and also for some of the theistic and theurgic principle and practices that came out of after. Now you notice that in Plotinus on the left, the technical term for this, and I find this fascinating, is the idea of the hypostases. You can think of these as ways of, these are three realities that are conceptually stacked, but they bleed into each other. They're neither a continuum nor are they separate realms. They're not quite superimposed. You can think of them as being like different amplitudes or different frequencies. And the possibility that, from a higher level, meaning a more immaterial level or a more light-based level, as it comes down into dark matter, that's always called an emanation. And an emanation always has a little bit of that biblical sense of the fall or the fall from grace or the fall of Icarus. The other part is going up is the transcendent. And we can find transcendence being celebrated and elaborated, particularly in the Neoplatonist school and through many of the movements up until, Nietzsche's claims about the end of metaphysics and I guess the foreclosure of metaphysics resulting in a finitude that gives us only immanence as the only option, which is also a very popular idea that even taken to the realm of maybe pantheism cheats at that a bit. But you can think of this movement through different levels, and maybe it's like an ocean, right? Because I had a friend, believe it or not, one of my undergraduate colleagues became a sub commander, and he said one of the things you can do to hide from an enemy submarine is go to a different thermal gradient. So once you drop to a certain level, the molecules in the ocean band together by temperature. And so the colder ones will sink and the warmer ones will rise. And so it creates a banding, temporal banding. And he said, if you drop to different levels, then the sonar and the radars don't work as well. And it becomes like a cloaking device. So you can think of it as like, different amplitudes between the one and, the part of your mind that is, divine, given by God or given by, the divinity, the world soul, which is the part of your part of your soul that actually deals with your body and the world, and then the sense world itself too. This schema is the idea of a gradiated, and it's not just stacked, but there's kind of a flow within it. So the hypostasis is a very sophisticated construct, as you can imagine. And then we'll stop in about 15 minutes and take a break. So we're right on the schedule. So one of the fundamental idiosyncrasies of Plato's work, particularly his cosmology as it's described in the Timaeus, is this idea of a chora. It is a receptacle that he calls it also, uses very poetic language to describe something that's indescribable. And the chora is I guess it's not a valve, it's not a sieve, it's not a garden. There's a lot of things it's not. But he described it in Timaeus in particular as a receptacle. So, and there's a lot of debate over the translation of that. And, does that also mean sieve? Does it also mean fountain? Right? Or is the receive itself in every kind of character? So it must be devoid of character, right? Therefore, we must not call chora the mother and receptacle of visible and sensible things, either earth or air or fire or water. But we shall not be wrong if we describe it as invisible and formless, all-embracing, possessed in a most puzzling way of intelligibility and hard to grasp. So he's talking about this, almost like this exception to a rationally ordered understanding of this dualist model of the universe. There's a little valve, or there's a leak, or there's something, but it's actually quite important because it's almost like what happens before the flash of the Big Bang, if I can mix these two, incommensurate systems, where something comes out of nothing. And the horror for him was the explanation of how everything can come out of nothing. And then one of the, I put I think a Substack reading because it was very accessible. And I think that's okay too. I don't think we have to always just read uh, precise philosophical arguments, but also when we're learning how to diagram philosophy, we can also look at more commonplace or more idiosyncratic interpretations. Because of that, from the diagram, one of the alternate readings I gave you guys, Cora is seen as part of the process of becoming. How do things actually come into being? How does the craftsman get the material to make things in the world? Both the demiurge as the master craftsman, not quite God, but often associated with God later in Christianity, but also the idea that, what materials you're actually working, the material cause, as Aristotle would call it in his four causal frames. And this was seen, and this is a very good diagram, I think, because becoming and being are often seen as antithetical models and understanding of the world. In a world of pure becoming, as Heraclitus said, you cannot step in the same river twice. And I forget the name of his student, said you can't step in the same river once. The idea is that eternal flux and flow and change is the rule. And he used the word logos to describe it, not logos meaning law, but logos meaning the idea that, that's the unchanging rule. Being, as we've seen, is often used in this context to describe the essences of things. So, the chairness of chair, or your essence. So my mother is getting quite elderly, and she says, as I've got older, I just become more of myself. And I was like, that's actually a very Platonist argument, Mom, that you have an essence that only gets more refined over time, and you're not continuously changing or responding to context. And so the idea of being has within it something implied like stasis, unchangeable qualities, whereas becoming is, the frothing dynamic river that will not stay in its boundaries. Like I was going to show the map of the Mississippi River mapped over 100 years and how much it changes and moves around too. So you've got these two different models of the world. And for Plato and for many of the Neoplatonists too, it was not a war and it was not a choice, but it was a question of how come we can see it both ways. So something has to allow things to come into the world to give the materiality to their preordained forms or essences. Here's where it gets really complex and interesting. And that thing, he calls it Lakora, because the becoming is producing things that eventually can become the good. The Lakora itself is undefined. It's called an empty matrix, a womb, a receptacle. And this also in a lot of post-structuralist philosophy is taken into some very interesting tangents that we'll look at in a minute. In Timaeus, the Cora is radically indeterminate and formless. Only if it escapes order, property, and propriety. And only is it possible to have a cosmos if something before the Cora is happening that does not have that order. It hovers on the very edge of nothingness, never showing itself as itself. It's not a character, it's not a space, it's not a location. It's this abstract concept of how becoming turns into being, or how things that don't exist start to, appear in the world. And they often appear through glimpses and through fragments, and it's never fully known to us. So the description actually is very cinematic. I'll get to that in a minute. But only in conjunction with the presence of elemental bodies as traces. This is what Derrida talks about when he wrote the very significant essay, which I put in the readings too. Now, Kristeva, unlike Derrida, focuses on a slightly different nuance of the same text in Timaeus. And she starts to articulate this idea of the hora as a fundamental semiotic hora, where meanings are produced and relationships are produced. And then she also moves against, as a feminist, she moves against the Freudian Oedipal triangle and argues for the mother-child relationship as also being a matrix or a receptacle where both subjectivity and language are formed, right? She calls the Cora a maternal receptacle, a generative matrix, an eternal place. So she inflects the language of Plato in a very different way than Derrida inflected the exact same language. And again, there's only like 4 or 5 sentences about Cora in the Timaeus, right? The Cora is a posited space which the language and the subject develop. In its Platonic context, it is imaginative, It's a theoretical necessity. It answers the question, what came first? Where does it come from, right? But argues the breaking away of the maternal space in the Hora is a paradoxical movement because it's both pushing in and against. The result is that Hora is no more than the place where the subject is both generated and negated, the place where their unity succumbs before the process of changes and stasis that produce them. So in some ways, it is an equilibrium or a truce between being and becoming. And that is, in some ways, the general schema that came out of the textual description of the Hora. Derrida writes about the Hora being from Plato, receptivity, the receptacle. The spacing of Hora introduces a dissociation or a difference in the proper meaning that it renders possible, thereby compelling topic detours which are no longer rhetorical figures. So he's arguing against representation, saying the Hora, which is this weird thing that produces everything, cannot be represented. He says it's radically non-human, it's atheological. It doesn't create or produce itself. It is not an event, and therefore it avoids any sort of anthropomorphic or theomorphic schemas. So he talks a lot about the naming of the Hora and the identity and how it avoids any sort of identity, but it produces things that are often known only for their effects. Just as a curiosity, Derrida also did a design project with some architects, Peter Eisenman and Bernard Schumi, who won the Parc Villette competition, and he asked Eisenman to design a part of it, and Eisenman said, I want to work with Derrida because he's very interested in deconstruction at the time. And Derrida's essay on the Hora came out, and so the New York architect, Peter Eisenman, asked Derrida, let's design this project together. Derrida mails him this drawing and a cassette tape in French explaining what it means. So that's Derrida's actual drawing of the Hora, which was misinterpreted quite liberally by the architects as a lyre, a musical instrument like a harp. But if you know how a harp works, you can see that there's a two-way grid in there, so those strings wouldn't vibrate, so it actually wouldn't produce music that way. So it's also been argued that it's a sieve, and that's the way it was interpreted. And on the actual garden design, you can see in this book called Choral Works, edited by Jeff Kipnis and Thomas Leeser. They look at that correspondence and that dialogue about how the Hora itself, when you try to represent it, creates all sorts of negative feedback loops that present it from represent. This is just an abstract summarizing this detailed argument at length, and arguing that there's both an architectonic and a cinematic model of the Hora that has been underdeveloped. And so this is a paper that I sent that to the Derrida conference, and I might send it into Angelica because Angelica is having a call for papers coming up on the Hora as well. It's come back in fashion. John Salas's book on chorology is quite interesting because he rejects any hasty translation of core into notions like place or space. And I've read this book a couple of times because it's incredibly fascinating in that he goes very, very, strictly back to the Platonic interpretations, but also the Greek context. He knows the language quite well, and also the construction and structure of not just social spaces, but temporality as well, too. So he says that basically the core itself, this distinction between the core itself and its images is the heart of the problem, that it's something that produces all things that could exist in the world irregularly, erratically, and without reason, but also at the same time resists all forms of representation. And this is what Eisenman was emphasizing. Identity and essence are also bracketed off in a sense. And so the next question I have for you, and let's go back into chat. So in your cosmology, your understanding of your model of reality, do you think that you need an origin? If you see the world as being, based on antagonism and conflict, and the world is a slippery, unpredictable, trickster-based environment where one has to maintain one's balance and dignity against all odds, which is actually an Aztec philosophy. I'm reciting a book called Aztec Metaphysics. Does it have an origin? Does it need an origin point? Another way to ask that is, as Deleuze argued I think in A Thousand Plateaus, that you have to always start in the middle, never at the origin. And so I'm going to ask you again, just before we go to break. Stop sharing. And your origin point may not be like some of the Greeks where it's chaos or the ocean or the unnameable formless. It might be something very different. It could be the Big Bang explosion. Um, it could have been, 6 days of work on creation and a day of rest. Does your model of reality have an origin point, or does it even need an origin point? This becomes quite significant as we move into the next discussion, where we get into the question of temporality. Uh, Needs a point of reference orientation. Yeah, we're about to cover Badiou and his argument that that point of reference always has to be outside of the system for the system to exist, which is his transformation of Plato. Good catch. Good catch. Yeah. Seems like more people are inclined towards being comfortable coming into the middle of something instead of having to establish, origin points. Origin points are often, Foucault will talk about this too in his works on genealogy, coming from genealogy of morals in Nietzsche and his idea of counter memories, that the origin is often overdetermined after the fact.
Could it be because like how we understand chaos kind of changed in this era? Like I think it's more like psychological now that chaos more than like it's like cosmological, like where how
Yeah,
everything begins.
yeah. I think it shows up even in like, little everyday activities. It used to be very rude to walk into a class once the class started, and now you've got, students and instructors coming half an hour late, like nothing's wrong. But also the idea of, if you jump into a Netflix binge, everyone wants to start at the beginning. And I'm like, why don't you watch the last episode first and work it in reverse like a cockroach or something? Why don't you just, because we'll talk about this a lot next week, but the question about, this developed model you have, your kind of internal guidance system, whether it's immanent, transcendent, metaphysical, materialist, idealist, there's thousands of labels, positivist. Where did it come from? Because in some ways we were talking before about, is there a place for chaos in your system? Most people said yes. What I'm seeing here when I say, is there an origin? Someone will have taught you language. Someone will have taught you, how things work. Um, and yet it seems like there's a greater skepticism or distrust of origins now. And I don't know if that's because of the post-truth environment or if it's because we're comfortable being in multiple, media situations or having multiple conversations at the same time. Because the origin would also imply something like lineage, genealogy, that's Foucault's argument, but also this idea of uh, a sequence. And so maybe it's also a distrust of singular sequences or linear sequences that's coming out too. I don't know. I'm just curious about that. That's why I asked it as a question. Because I remember a lot of my professors when I was a student were obsessed with tracking the origins and precedents of things, whether it was a city or a linguistic term, the etymology. I found this great quote by Voltaire. We said etymology is what's the word? I'm losing the word. Um, is a science uh, where consonants count for very little and vowels nothing at all. And no, this is great.
But I think origin and precedence are very different, no?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
something could have infinite precedence.
yeah. So there's a legal and rhetorical model. Like you find that in Vico and a lot of the masters of rhetoric, back to Cicero too, establishing a genealogy through legal precedent, but also through linguistic precedents. And often that was used to overdetermine, at least for the people I worked with that came from the Renaissance tradition, that was held to a very high standard, often as a way to refute the dominance of church or state for determining what is of value. So it was never quite neutral, and arguing, what is the origin, say, of pick one of the conflicts going on in the world right now. What is the origin of that conflict is obviously an unanswerable question. Because you can go back, grievance by grievance in reverse. You can look at, how much of it's being caused by climate change and influencing other things that are not being watched and such. But people would, there's a lot of obsession about this, particularly at both ends of the Enlightenment, about the question of origins and, the question of pedigrees. And even with Darwin, the only time Darwin drew something, I'll show it next week if you're interested, was the evolutionary tree. He actually did a drawing to explain the complexity of how different species die out and how some diversify too. And he left the origin quite ambiguous as well. Obviously something that sequence in reverse. But when we talk about temporality next week and we look at, being pushed and pulled and whether the present is actually part of time itself or is something different, the question of origin will take a different spin as well. So I'm kind of gauging the temperature in the room in terms of whether origins are things that people discuss or value, or they use them as I guess, value markers. Because I always tell people I'm from Chicago, assuming that explains everything about that's all you need to know. But there's obviously lots of different types of ways of being from Chicago too. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, in myth too, many of the Greek myths, but also I'm reading Colosso's Ka, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and about some of the Vedic and early Hindu myths too. That this idea, the origin stories are often more fascinating than the adventures of the characters themselves, and how they came into being is also radically different too. Okay. What I want to do very quickly in the time we've got, because we want to take a break soon. Right? We've been at it about an hour and a half. I think we'll take our break now. I still have to talk a little bit about Badiou's event, and then we'll do some diagramming if that's okay. So, can I trust everyone to come back in 15 minutes? Is that enough? Is that too much?
There are a couple of questions,
Oh,
perhaps.
I'm sorry.
I saw some hands raised and then dropped.
Okay. Can you help me with that? I'm not seeing hands raised right now, but I've
No,
got the
they dropped their hands. So if they want to ask their question, should they ask them now or
Yeah,
after?
yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed it. I didn't see any.
So if there are any questions, perhaps you can ask them now.
Yeah, it's very hard to see hands up when I'm presenting from the
Yeah.
PowerPoint. Uh,
Sorry, I'll just say I accidentally raised my hand. I was fumbling around my phone.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
I'm
Sorry, I
engaged.
just
Yeah.
Definitely curious
Yeah.
just for questions right now.
No, I welcome that now because so many people are being accused of their writing being written by AI. So I'm like, I don't do spell check anymore to prove that I'm human. It's okay to make mistakes now.
Okay, I think now we can go to break.
You want
Uh,
to do that? Yeah.
yeah.
And we'll call it in, see everyone in about, is 15 minutes. That's what I did last class. 15 minutes is enough. You can
Yeah.
do a stretch or have a cigarette. You can't watch a Netflix. Scratch your cat, read a book. There's lots of things you can do in 15 minutes. Re-energize, go do your thing, and then come back and we'll talk about a theory of the event from a Neoplatonist Vadu. Not really Neoplatonist. And then we'll get into some drawing exercises. The other thing is get a pad of paper or a collection of paper and a couple different drawing implements and or a tablet with a stylus. So you're welcome to use analog
Not launch. Launching. Mhm.
Hi, are we starting?
Yep. I'm just typing a message. We are back.
Okay.
People might see that in the pop-ups. All right. Okay, so in this part, I've still got, I think, 5 slides. I just ran out of steam. Talk about Badiou and event, and the one recommended reading was on that topic. Um, Normally, what I've been doing is I'll give you way too many readings with the assumption that you'll read 0 to 1, find something that interests you. If you don't read all of them, I haven't read all of them in depth more than once. Um, but I basically each course I'll say here's a text you should read, and then here's a whole bunch, if you're interested or if you find it helpful. But don't have any guilt and don't have any, I guess, anxiety around the fact that I'm over posting possible readings. I tried to mark it as much as possible that it was actually for you to consider if you're interested. So I always have just one assigned reading as we go through this. And I'll post next week, so I'll start posting those tomorrow. I have too many to choose from, so a lot of my problem is actually editing and selection. But we'll get on that. So let me talk for a few minutes about this idea of the event, and particularly in Badiou's philosophy, and its similarity and difference from Plato, where he drew his inspiration from to some degree. And then we're going to try to do. I've got 4 prompts. I think we can get three diagrams done in the time we've got left, which is pretty good. I think next week I'm going to mix it up a bit, and I'll talk for less, and then we'll diagram, then I'll talk again, and then we'll diagram. I think that's easier for all of us too. So learning as we go. Okay, and the event. So Badiou, as I mentioned, very strong proponent of aspects of Plato. Is one of my professors when I was working on my second doctorate at the European Graduate School many, many years ago. Um, and he was actually writing his book about Deleuze at the time too. But he defines being as not the one. So this goes against Neoplatonist reappropriation of the good as the one. He describes another condition, which is called the count as one, which is another way of thinking about it in terms of everyday life. So all of the apparatuses, all of the conveniences, all of the flows, all of the situations and conditions around you as you move through this, this plenum or this environment of your everyday life, as Lefebvre critiqued famously. That aspect he calls it count as one because it all seems to be integrated. It's like this is my neighborhood, this is my coffee shop, those are my bills. And it all has this appearance of being a continuity. But he argues, much like Leibniz, that actually it's not, that it's artificially being congealed into a uniformity, but it's actually multiple things that can be broken down to multiple things. And Leibniz talked about that in monadology, that, especially after the development of the microscope, that everything taken down to multiple levels just reveals more and more complexities, right? And he also has this idea of the void, which is very important. So it's the idea that within any organization, with any assemblage, with any, I guess, collection or series, there's always one thing that has to be excluded that is also, simultaneously foundational. And he uses often the void to describe that. So for any set or any configuration or any category, there's always one thing that has to be excluded from that. We'll talk a little bit about in the third week when we look at Foucault and the dispositif, how that argument works with the idea of man being both inside the table of creatures, but also outside the table too. And he argues, again, differently than Plato, that being is neither one nor multiple. He argues for a kind of an ambiguous position that, the idea of the oneness of being is something that we have to, construct or actively develop against the evidence of multiplicity. But the default setting is multiplicity, and the one is absent, and that explains why there's many and not one. Since the one is an operation, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the idea of understanding the universe as one or being as a totality for him is operational, it's procedural, it is constructivist in a sense. It is something that is based very close to, almost uses a language that we shall see more on faith and fidelity, right? Therefore, everything that is multiple also has multiple representations and presentations. So multiplicity, like scales of infinity, or the transfinite, as Cantor would call it. These ideas are also multiplicities within multiplicities is implied in his work. But he always uses mathematics as a way to ground it and also to formalize it, particularly Cantor and set theory. The multiple splits, the multiple of presentation, the multiple of the everyday counted as one, is consistent, whereas a retroactively discerned multiple that will have been counted, the domain of the count, remains inconsistent. This is part of his argument. Let's put it more simple. He says that every now and then, not all the time, but perhaps once in a lifetime or once in an era, something will happen that will become an event. And an event is something that breaks and ruptures that count as one experience of the everyday. Badou's account of the nature of the event is how something new can come into the world. So unlike the idea of the Hora or the idea of the craftsman creating things, for him, it's actually an event that interrupts, that breaks. And for him, the event with a capital E is something that is both unexpected. In many ways, it's not only disruptive, it's unrepresentable and sometimes incomprehensible. And it also comes often as a surprise and by stealth. And one of the things to think about in terms of his idea of the event, he describes it as undecidable. So it could be a situation where a simple act or gesture creates an entirely new relationship. He argues that if we look at this diagram from the essay from Hallward, Hallward's book is actually quite good, I think, in explaining Badiou without getting too obscure. An event is an undecidable occurrence, not an actual occurrence like Whitehead would say, but an event is something that basically splits your life or the world in two, before the event and after the event, but it's undecidable in the moment that it happens, right? And then nomination is an attempt to describe it. And then from that attempt to describe it, then a subject position is formed, which is still somewhat indiscernible. This is also very much, and people point out, it's very much like Sartre's argument for the existential claim that you can decide at any moment that you're no longer a smoker or you're no longer a fascist, that the existentialist choice and free will is embedded in this idea. But for Badiou, the event is always something that is delivered or given, often with this sense of surprise. There's not a lot of foreshadowing for it. He identifies the four truth procedures where this happens as science. So often that's a discovery that think of the Copernican revolution, the Einsteinian revolution. He talks about it in terms of art. That, for example, the Schoenberg's 12-tone musical system that just divides music into the before and after through that event of the development of those things. He describes it in terms of politics, and his favorite example is the French Revolution and how that might have had multiple origins or multiple causes, but once it started going, its significance was undeniable and time became irreversible because of this. And then the fourth one is in love. And he said, so falling in love itself is both unexpected and in many ways is an event that forms a new subjectivity. You kind of change yourself. And then he later wrote about St. Paul, who was the founder of the Catholic Church, and how his conversion was based also on this act of fidelity. So from that moment of the event being infinite and undecidable, that creates or puts you into a position of turbulence or uncertainty where you have to form a new subject position around that event. I am now a non-smoker. I am now anti-fascist. I am now, the head of the Catholic Church. All those examples he taught, I'm a revolutionary in favor of beheading the monarchy. All of the examples you can find of these subject positions, these subject formations, are organized around the undecidability of the event. So it has ripples and wave effects far beyond its actual occurrence in time. And you can see in this diagram from the essay I gave, which is also, it's a really clear diagram, except the line weights are all the same. The finite side and the infinite side, and it's crossing back and forth. This is not the logical square of opposition, but from that subject position, then you become like a soldier through an act of fidelity towards that as your truth event or your truth moment. And so your truth and your subjectivity. And then, there's always the question, this came up and he had to write a book about it. what if your subjectivity is towards something that's evil? What if your fidelity, your truth is actually an evil thing? And how do you preclude that from happening? And then from that, from understanding and occupying this truth, because he argues that philosophy is for producing truths, and there's only four forms of truths that can be, created through philosophical activity, and that, love, science, art, and politics. He leaves religion out of it, and many other things too. But he contrasts that in his book in Deleuze. He was like, Deleuze is not a philosopher because Deleuze believes that concepts are, the goal of philosophy. The philosophy is for producing concepts, not producing truth. He says, therefore, Deleuze is an artist and not a philosopher. So for him, truth, which is the Platonic, highest ideal, becomes a new way of understanding not just subjectivity, but reorganizing the world around these unexpected, unanticipated events. This is, we'll just talk about this very briefly, that, until the event happens, time is, in many ways unformatted or, indeterminate. And it's only from that moment that it's like there was a before and after. Right? For an event to take place, the subject must recognize the existence of a truth and set about constructing a site from the always inadequate vocabulary available to them in the pre-evental situation. So you're kind of like stammering or struggling and trying to make sense, bring both first the sensible and then the intelligible to it, right? And here you can see some examples. And then because of that, the subject formation is always organized around this thing that happens to you, not something that you actively construct yourself. He says you can exist prior to becoming a subject. Again, the existentialist argument. Two different models I found based on, two gendered models of the four discourses of truth. You can see love, science, art, and politics overlapping in this in the essay I was reading, as opposed to being different way stations or more of a network. Let's jump into diagrams. So what good is a diagram? What do diagrams do? Through the entire workshop, I'm going to try to convince you that diagrams produce effects. So in some ways they might be artistic. Philosophical diagrams clarify relationships and establish new forms of visibility of the invisible. And our standard is not to prove that something is true, and diagrams often can go a long way. But that standard I mentioned before, that's more often used in the professions and the creative industries, of the idea of demonstration, not proof. Here you can see the anatomical theater. So particularly, in the period once it became acceptable to dig up bodies and to do dissections, it was done for knowledge. In this case, in Louvain, I believe this is the surgical theater, again organized in the idea of the radiating circles around the point of knowledge. And this woodcut, I think from the 1600s, also shows that idea of the not just the transparency, but also the significance of the process of dissection as a form of revelation of truth, but not proof of anything, but a demonstration. Oh, this is connected to that, or this works with that. My not so secret project. This is what I've been thinking about since I started working on this course recently. This summer, I would like to develop a diagrammatics of how myth forms a cognitive infrastructure. And I'd like to do a new language, my own, because I've been diagramming for a long time. I want to find a new way to do this. So I'm just kind of having a confession right now. One of my motives for doing this course is to help make sense of other ways to go about. I want to find a new technique that is as sophisticated as the paragraphs of the great writer Roberto Colasso. If you don't know, his work is a contemporary and a friend of Umberto Eco. I won't read this paragraph to you because my voice is going, but you got to get a sense of the way that he writes about mythology and braiding together different lines of thought. So I'll just let that hang for a minute. This is from a book. He does comparative mythology in a very creative way. Cadmus and Harmony was one that made him famous. It was about obscure ideas of ethics in Greco-Roman philosophy. His book Ka is specifically about Indian cosmology and Indian philosophy. So now we're forming a reading group as a way to motivate me to actually finish reading, because it's very, very dense and fascinating. And it's written in a mythopoetic, not scientific or philosophical way. So I'm just going to throw this question out here more rhetorically. So that's my ambition for teaching the course in Truth in Advertising. Because I think I know the field well. I need, when I was a little kid, I played soccer and I got to go as a pretty good soccer player when I was 15 to England, and we got completely massacred. I stopped playing soccer after that. It was so humiliating. At least have ads in the paper saying, local club, stronger opposition wanted. We're looking for like better teams to play against. And I'm kind of at that point too. So for me, this course is also a way to not just review some of the things that I think that I've mastered and made sense of and share them with people, but also to become more receptive to other ways to approach that. So if you have any ambitions for exploring the diagrammatics, I'm happy. We'll probably do that maybe we'll do this at the beginning of the next class as a way of doing introductions. So instead of what is diagramming good for, a different question, what is a good diagram? So some of you will know this, and apologies again if I'm stating the obvious. This is just reminding you again, diagrammatics requires a faith and fidelity to this multiplicity, as multiple iterations and emerging series will form a living bestiary of figures of thought. So this is telling us that we're going to try many approaches. The first steps towards a good diagram, and this is not from a textbook, this is just from learned experience. You have to start with a clear underlying geometry or topology that corresponds to the situation you're trying to diagram. So a circle is really good. A circle is really good for things that are, working not just cyclically, but also equidistant from each other or orbiting around an absent center. Triangles, and the Bauhaus used to have this entrance exam where they'd have a circle, square, and triangle, red, blue, and yellow crayon, and you had to get the right color and the right shape to be admitted to the university. That was their only entrance requirement. And the triangles were always red because they were the most aggressive shape. So a triangle is often about three things that are pulling apart or out of sequence, but also a triangle forms the most stable structural form in terms of chairs, camera tripods. When I have students doing doctoral research, I say triangulate your methods. Use three unrelated methods so you have a better chance of approximating what is the actual case. Squares, including squares of oppositions, which have diagonals of negation within them, or as a stack. We've seen some examples already of stacks. Spiral diagrams, grids. So usually the first choice is actually what is the underlying geometry or pattern that will help me make sense of this when you're doing a diagram. Right. And as they tell you in the beginning graphic design, compose the empty space. If you have two squares, you can space them equally. If you rotate one, now you've got dynamic intersections. And that was also a Bauhaus exercise. Take two squares and place them in a position to create joy or, to create triumph or to create tranquility. And so it's composing the empty space, but also leaving enough space for things to fill in. Then the next step, and we'll come back to this again. Oh, misspelled dominant. Get one dominant concept in there. A concept, remember, at a minimum, defines the relationship between two abstractions. So a concept like light surrounds nature, or light bestows knowledge, or nature thrives in light. Whenever you've got two abstractions and an action word between them, you've got like the basic molecule for a concept. And we use this a lot in the design fields too, as a generator for concept-generated thinking. But a concept usually will have to have those parts, often many more, and being very customized. Sorry about that. My chat box just disappeared. I'm sorry about that. I'll stop sharing in a minute and go back to the chat box. Okay. Then you get a dominant process in there. So once you've got the underlying geometric schema and you have at least one concept articulated through its two or three names or parts, then you think about a dominant process. You can think in terms of circuits or sequences, energies or transformations, or any sort of passages, even like rabbit holes within rabbit holes, as you move from phase to phase, or from abstraction to abstraction, or from one entity to another. So you've noticed in all the diagrams we've looked at, both the simple and the complex ones, there was a clear geometry, but there was also differentiation of the parts. And this is the part that I would strongly encourage too. Make sure you have one or more unique or unexpected elements or events or entities included. Never be generic. Don't ever do a diagram that someone else could do. Always make sure you've got your unique take. If there's something that is an obsession or a fetish, get it in the diagram. Don't exclude it. Don't edit yourself. The whole point of the diagram is to reveal these things, these particles of other realities that could possibly come out, and to take pride in that. That's why I said there's no right way to do it. And one of the best ways to do a good diagram, There's a lot of times people, darkness and light, nature and concrete. They'll often start with binaries and try to position themselves on them or show a symbiotic relationship. And it's like the first surrealist technique would be take two unrelated things entirely, like I don't know, justice and lobsters, and make a diagram with that, and just kind of force the irreconcilability. So you start to reconfigure and rethink the world in a different way. So this is just a plea um, to be structured, to be ordered, to be clear, to be hierarchical, but also in a very deep way, as Zizek, keep your pathological kernel up front and center, whatever you're working on, the enigma, the problem, the X that cannot be solved, the desire that cannot be named. That's got to go in the diagram. Otherwise, you're just doing generic stuff and no one's going to benefit from it. Here's an example of a subjectivity diagram. Joseph Campbell studied lots of different myth systems and concluded that all heroes go through the same passage. Um, and you can see it. This is also a divided world. There's the ordinary world. Here we are again. This sounds Platonist. And then there's the special or the hidden world. And he has to pass through the underworld or through this, ordeal in another place. I think it was it Tolstoy or Dostoevsky said there's only two stories in the world. A man leaves the village to go on an adventure, and a stranger comes to town. And then he says it's the same story from two different points of view. This is Charles Minard's map of Napoleon's march unsuccessful. Very good diagram used by Tufte to explain data visualization, where they've mapped the movement of Napoleon's march to Moscow, and the width of the gray line shows the number of troops who survived, and the black line is the retreat, and it's been mapped, and at the bottom there's also the topographical heights as well. So it's combining four different axes of information into a two-dimensional drawing, so it's a very good diagram. This is an example of airspace, which is how they legally control the flight and movements. In the same way, if you drive on a highway, there's dividers and there's off ramps and things. This exists in the air, but it's invisible to you, but it's heavily enforced and policed by different aerospace agencies in different countries. And it creates a condition where there's conduits and there's flows and there's apertures and then there's limits and ceilings and all these invisible boundaries that are, legally existing, but not physically touchable. So that's one example of a very good diagram. This is just an example of a film about a dream within a dream within a dream, and the dynamic spatio-temporal structure. This one is based on the idea of layering, obviously, but you also have linear segments. So there's 6 different characters in the upper left, and as they pass through these different types of realities, you can see their interactions or their fragmentation and separation. So you've got a linear system and a stack system combined in this example. Okay. The first drawing I would like you to try, and again, be brave. What are two distinct realities that you yourself can bring together in your creative critical work? So you could be like Batman, have a day job and a night job. You could have like a solar entity and a nocturnal entity, like Steppenwolf, right? You're like professor by day, carnivore by night. But you could also exist in 2 other realities, and just think about this in terms of, maybe there's different physics there, maybe there's different, laws of attraction, maybe there's different time scales. Most of my work on surrealism points out that there's a false dichotomy between the awake world and the dream world. And it was Freud himself who said the madman is the dreamer awake. The surrealist fantasy was to get rid of the boundary between everyday life and the dream world and to have them fuse together. That's actually Breton's definition in what he called a surreality. Okay. So some things to think about. I'll give you about 10 minutes to play with this. Have some fun with it. Your bonus points for scaring me or shocking me. Be brave. I once mistakenly on record said I wanted to have the most deviant and creative New Center course. And everyone's like, that's a really high standard to set for yourself. So now I'm just going for, freakishly authentic. So be creative and be experimental. And think about it, is there something you're working on if you already have a formed, certificate project for New Center and you want to use these diagrams to support it, please do that. Diagram what you're working on for your project and put the diagrams in your project, and everyone will be happy to see them. If you're working on, graphic novel, if you're working on world building, if you're working on two unrelated projects or disciplines at the same time, show what it's like to be, like the core itself operating between these two realms, or being the conduit or the hinge piece. And I'm not asking you to, force yourself to become bipolar or have a dissociative fugue, although those are good models of this, or spirit possessions, another good model. But what would it be like to live in two realities, or more precisely, how could you diagram what it's like to be in two realities at the same time? Even if you haven't experienced it, how do you think that could or should work? So it's basically a topological question. Is like, think about how these realities could come together. It could be concentric, could be two interlocking triangles. We'll look at that next week, right? Just make me a diagram of that relation. Once you have the image, if you're doing it by analog, just snap a little picture and throw it in chat, but try not to make it 600 megabytes. See if you can do it on a low resolution, because it takes forever to load in chat if you take a picture. If you want to draw on your tablet, if you want to collage or compose in some other software program, that's fine. And we'll give you a little extra time on this first one, because for some people this will be easy, and for some people they've probably never done this. And after you do it a couple times, again, diagrammatics is a discipline and a practice. After you do it a couple times, you'll start to really develop your own language, and it'll give you a degree of clarity.
Could it be more than two?
Yeah, that's the stronger opposite. Yeah. Okay, if you can hold more than two realities at the same time, that is a skill most people don't have. But yeah, show me what that looks like. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm slightly shocked by that question. So yes, extra credit for you. Good. Whoever is worried about your drawing skills, when you were 5, all of you could draw anything you were asked. You were all masters of it. It's just in the same way that you can use mathematics and linguistic skills, your drawing skills will be fantastic. And diagrams don't require any artistic skill. You can literally just have, 3 circles in a triangle with words in them to get the basics down. So, is it possible to upload images in the chat? It always has been when I've done this in other contexts, like working with doctoral students. I sure hope they don't have that disabled. I guess we'll find out. Yeah. We will hive mind figure it out. The other suggestion I have for you is don't overthink it. As we get more proficient at this, and as the questions become more customized, yeah. So draw a diagram, which means simplification of what it is like to bring together two worlds, two realities. Okay, yeah. The mobile zoom app. I have problems with my tablet with this too. If you don't have an ability to do that, please keep the drawings anyway, because there'll be a way you can submit them at the end so that we know that you've done them. But ultimately, these are to encourage you to think about the systems or the cosmologies or I guess the worlds that you're building. and pull them
I
into
have an
the graph.
idea
Yeah,
about how we upload. I can just send everyone a document and then can paste it to the document, so we would have a document for the session one with all the drawings, if that works
sure.
for you.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, because the chat box closes and then they disappear. But normally we did chat because we were lazy and we just throw it in there really quickly. So,
Yeah,
yeah, we can do that. Folder on the drive. Yeah, if you if you put your name or initials on it, that'll be good too. Um, yeah. So these two different worlds would perhaps have different tones. They might have different tempos. They might have different orientations. They might have different scales. Um, they could be, as I said, separated in time or space. They could be superimposed. They could be one inside the other. There's that China Mieville novel called The City in the City. It's about a city that's divided, and the people in one part of the city have trained themselves to ignore the other part of the city that they have to pass through. And then there's this one serial killer who's killing on both parts of the city, and they have to find a detective that can, see around that. So that would be a good example of that too, or like the Master and Margarita that is both about Jerusalem and Moscow at the same time. The one thing we never see in Alice in Wonderland is what she goes back to when she leaves Wonderland. We only get half the story. Although there have been some pretty clever prequels and sequels written around the Alice books. Give you about 2 more minutes to wrap that up. Again, don't overthink it. And since it looks like we'll run out of time, we can start off next time with some comments and feedbacks and discussions. I'll look at the document and do it then. I would like you to have one more under your belt before we finish. One minute, finishing touches. Okay, and that one's a wrap. You've done your first diagram of strange cosmogenesis. Take a victory lap and then look at those. All right, I'm going to jump ahead because there's a couple others we had. So this one is asking about, is a variation of it. If you could make a pocket universe, that is a creative term. For example, the galaxy that's actually held in the necklace in the first Men in Black film, or the entire civilization that lives in the top of a dandelion and Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who, is different from the clockwork universe we live in. Draw what would be the configuration of that pocket universe. If you could make a microcosmic world, and think about the shock of the scientists the first time they looked through a microscope at a drop of water and saw all these Bosch-like creatures eating each other. If you could make a microcosmic world that's different than ours, that you could actually carry around in your pocket, right? So that's your scale limitation, right? And so for those of you that have in the past or in the present have imaginary friends, secret memory chambers, like both Gina and Bruno, but also the detectives, and uncontrollable unconscious. If you have any experience with world building, feel free to riff off of those too. But if you had a microcosmic, think about it as a tiny cosmogenesis. And you can do this in a cartoon language. You can do it in a biomolecular language. You can do it in a landscape language. But have an experiment and think about, what a ultra small universe or world might look like. And so make a diagram of that pocket universe. And all the things we looked at the beginning with cosmogenesis were vast and unmeasurable and uncountably large. So, zoom us in as close, as small as you can. If we had more time and materials, I'd say take your drawing and make a model of it and then carry it around in your pocket and explain to people. Just as show them that you can build a world at small scale. And then one of the prompts here is about events. So I think we'll start with that next time because the next class is about temporality. So I'll put some of the readings of a lot of process philosophers and phenomenologists of early 20th century models of time that are not entirely linear. That's what we'll be looking at next week. I'll get those readings up in the next day or two. I was discussing this with a student once, and they were talking about the 10 million gut bacteria that live rent-free in their intestines. It's a type of micro-universe. You have a fantasy space, a dream space. If you've ever had a recurring dream, you probably have one of these, right? Where you're like, oh, this place again, right? Yeah. Yeah, this Alina, the student said, rent free because they're, just becoming acquainted with the logic of real estate. That was the prototype. I won't tell you what country they're from, but you can guess. Yeah, they actually have a significant influence on everything from mood to life expectancy.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
For the documents, I wrote down the prompts so that the diagrams fall behind the prompts. So if you
Okay,
added
great.
anything for the prompt too, can you move it to behind the sentence? Thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to figure these out. And then the one about drawing the event, we'll start with that next time. So we'll do a little drawing. And I hope that you are brave enough not to, because when you were 5, you didn't care if you drew the house or the dog accurately. You were very brave drawers when you were 5. I know that for a fact. So if you can kind of recuperate that confidence and just have a bash at it. Over the 4 courses, you will actually get quite good at this through iterative practice and stretching your knowledge systems in terms of what can be represented and how to represent them. So I'm overconfident that you guys are going to do a good job. Yeah. Trying to think who's the detective. Was it Sherlock Holmes that had the secret memory palace? You would go back and yeah, I think it was Sherlock Holmes. Do people have recurring dreams? I have a recurring nightmare. I still get this. When I got accepted to university, I stopped going to my classes in high school. And I still have this nightmare where they say your degrees don't count because you never finished high school and you have to come back and take a test to graduate high school. And I'm like, no, I'm a professor and a doctor and a dean. I'm not doing that. And they're like, none of your degrees count. You have to go back. And then I go and then the test is in a language I don't know. And I don't know why I have this dream now, but I still have this, and it's like going back to high school again. That's why I said it's always this sensation of a return to a place that's full of repressed memories. But if you've had experience, imagining, even if you read, a lot of people have the capacity to read, say, for example, novels and actively picture what they're seeing, and then they're often disappointed with the cinematic representations because their imaginations are more rich than most of the films too. But this is actually a good sign. That's the type of capacity. What Hegel dismissed as picture thinking for diagrams is actually quite crucial. We'll give everyone, or right at that time, we'll give everyone 2 more minutes. Again, don't overthink it. This is exercising your creative and critical thinking skills.
Can I ask a question maybe for next session?
Yes, please.
So I've been thinking about this question actually a lot because of my own research. So I would be interested to discuss, next session when we have time, about the difference between a diagram and a model, and how can that
Yeah.
um but I know we don't have time now, so I'm just gonna we can skip it for next session.
Yeah, no, that's good. And particularly in the 3rd session, we'll look at when we read about the dispositif, we'll look at the difference between diagrams, apparatuses, cartographies, because Guattari often talks about, the slippage between diagram and cartography. And we'll look at a lot of the, I guess, that process philosophy approach. And also, I made just a little caveat today about mathematical graph is not a diagram. But you're actually asking a very profound question in a sense, because it implies the boundary of what's not a diagram, or what is excluded categorically from diagramming. And that's why at the beginning I hinted at it. I was like, philosopher diagrams, artist diagrams, sorcerer diagrams. They're all diagrams in a sense, but they represent different things in different ways, very, not interchangeably. So I don't have any easy answer, but I'm also interested, if you would like, I'll try to customize some of the readings for the 3rd week of people looking at that kind of question. Because there's a book by Evelyn Bois, for example, called Painting as Model, that was looking at this, Renaissance idea of the model and the type and the typology. And even things like Curvier's comparative anatomy, which gave rise to architectural typologies and building typologies, and where you didn't have to learn all the instances, you just learn the model and then you make copies of the model. But it's a really good question because the schema comes in there as well. And when we diagram processes, it's very, very different than when you're diagramming relationships between abstractions or, essential, static entities too. So it's a huge topic actually. And for
I
me, it
think
sounds like about the boundaries, right?
I think I also wanted to ask because I am actually working on an essay that I wanted to write about a friend's artwork,
Oh,
and
yeah.
this question actually came up a lot. And I guess I'll just say one thing that for me it's I think that's something I'm thinking about right now, which is if let's say you have a diagram that explains a phenomenon, but it does it so how can I put this? There's a limit to which, a diagram can be a representation of a phenomenon and also stand in as the phenomenon itself. So basically,
Yeah.
my friend is,
Yeah. So,
kind of builds machines basically, and these machines kind of obey certain physical fluids and whatever. And these
yeah.
machines are diagrammatic in a sense. This is what I'm trying to say. But then they also basically enact the very physical properties that they also represent. So I don't know if that's,
Now, I've got some material, say, for example, like the Deleuze book on Francis Bacon and diagrams. I don't think it's very good, say, compared to his work on cinema, which is not very diagrammatic, except maybe the idea of the mobile section. And I'm thinking of, say, some of the works of the kinetic sculptor Jean Tinguely and his very florid diagrams of different wheels and just circles of colors that are almost like impressionistic or psychedelic, and then his machines are all like hard rusted metal and moving in very repetitive ways too, and that kind of friction between the representation and the act itself. It's fascinating at that level too, because you talked about the limit condition of representation as being distinct from as you said, almost like like the IKEA catalog drawing versus the mods you've done to the IKEA work after transformed it and turned into something else, and it's gone out of alignment and things in terms of its, I guess, its contingencies or its entropy. Um, but yeah, maybe the question is how you build what's the most important invisible components, or what is the secret circuit in the work, and how does a diagram allow you to represent that, knowing that the map is not the territory and the diagram is not the artwork, but the artwork perhaps could never come into existence without the diagram. That's where it gets very interesting, because you're now jumping across different registers. And the one thing that diagrams are really good at, I can't think of too many other disciplines, if you can diagram a process, it's because it's sublinguistic. You can very easily turn a diagram from, and I remember I got thrown out of an art history program. They said, you're not rigorous, you're not scientific. You designers, you take a poem and turn it into a teacup. And I'm like, that's our superpower. And we do it by diagramming it, right? What are the parts? What are the elements? How do they work? So there's also a transcoding process, not a transduction in terms of energy states, but a transcoding from one form of expression to another that makes it really fascinating. Because I imagine if we looked at your colleagues' a work of art and asked everyone to diagram it, you get radically different diagrams, in the same way you get radically different descriptions. And for me, I find that very exciting because there's no overdetermination. There's just a question of what is the case? What is the case here? That would be the philosophical question. What exactly is the case in this work of art exists, and how the diagram allows you to make some answers around that. But no, that's good. I'll get some of those Tinguely. Sam ran a good essay about Tinguely's diagrams and his kinetic sculpture. That's the work I'm familiar with. That's quite old. All right, is everyone good on your second diagram, your pocket universe? We will not have time to talk about them, unfortunately. So your series of diagrams leading up to this is what we're going to do as our in-class assignment. So you have a little portfolio, and then your final diagram and explanation will be your final project. So there you won't be able to do much with text-based outcomes for this course. I would very much like you to get comfortable doing these apparatuses of capture. Okay. So we're a little over time. I'll try to get it under control for next week. I'll also try to break it up more with more breaks of talking and drawing. Any last questions or comments before we hit the kill switch? Depending on where you live, it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner time. So I don't want to hold you up any longer. I think that would be kind and just let everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for letting me share my obsessions with you. And I hope in this process that you will become very brave diagrammers of the invisible, and that you'll actually find some joy in doing that too. So next week readings are about temporality and time consciousness and cones of perception. And then the week after, we will look at dispositifs and diagrams, apparatuses, and now art machines and works of art. I will plug that in based on Nikos's question today. So thank you for that. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
It was
you
a great session.
much.
Thank you.